Yo, what's up, YouTube? This is your boy Alex. I'm back, and I'm gonna put the first episode of this on my sports channel, and then I'm gonna actually make an actual YouTube channel that is just devoted and dedicated to boxing, wrestling, and martial arts. Now, I know you guys have probably been shaking your head like, what took me such a long time to get to boxing? And I'm here. This is the first episode. Yes, this is the first episode of Boxing What If. On this new original boxing series, it will contain 10 episodes a season. So this is season 1, the first episode. The season premieres today on a Monday, surprisingly. And this will contain 10 episodes where we talk about heavyweights, welterweights, middleweights, light heavyweights, and the boxing division from past, present, and future. Today's episode is a what if of boxing of two of the biggest and brightest stars of their era. Both fighters came in the 1980s. Both fighters had their rise to fame in the 80s. And both these fighters had their falls and their demises in boxing in the 90s. And by the 2000s, both these fighters became a shell of each other, and neither one of them were able to return to that past glory that they once had. One being a three-time heavyweight champion, the other only winning one championship in hopes to do the same exact goal. Both fighters have a lot in common, and both fighters actually fought Lennox Lewis. And you'll be shocked. Some of you will probably already know who I'm referring to when I mention these two names. But these two fighters did come in the 80s. I was born in the 80s, and I were fans of both these heavyweights. I wasn't just a huge fan of Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis. Those were just two heavyweights that I liked. But these two heavyweights were guys that when you got in the ring, hold on, every time I do a video, somebody wants to call and blow up my phone. Hold on, people, hold on. Hello? Good morning, how are you? Yes. Not today. I got a bed coming to the house, and I don't know what time they're gonna come. All right. Thank you. Sorry about that. That was my job calling me. Like I told you in my other YouTube videos, they love to call unannounced and unattended. I don't want my days off to go to work. Worked all last week. Like I was saying, back to the video appreciation. I apologize. These two heavyweights. I liked them because they always knocked people out. Iron Mike Tyson versus Tommy the Duke Morrison. Now, these two fighters are synonymous with boxing in the heavyweight division. Mike Tyson, born and raised in Catskill, New York. We all know the story of Mike Tyson, or at least most of us do. And we all know there's the Oklahoma-born Tommy Morrison. Both fighters came from nothing, and both fighters rise to fame and fortune in a blink of an eye. These were supposed to be the two premier heavyweights of the 1980s and 90s that was supposed to lead us into the 2000s, which we know it didn't happen. But my point is, these two guys had a lot of common. Mike Tyson started off boxing at the age of 17 or 18 years old. Mike Tyson was just a kid doing boxing. Now, his mother, got sick and passed away. He had to go to like at least 4 or 5 foster homes. His sister had to work 2 jobs. And every now and then on the weekends, he could see his sister because his sister had 2 jobs. His sister did graduate from high school and college and got 2 jobs, but he had to go to 4 or 5 different foster homes. And one of these foster homes that Mike Tyson got sent to was where he got to meet a very special man. He got to meet boxing legend. I think his name is Jake LaMotta or Costamata. I know someone's going to correct me on that. It's okay if you correct me. It's been a while since I know my boxing history. That this became his boxing trainer. Now, he had another boxing trainer named Teddy Atlas, but Mike Tyson couldn't keep his hands to himself, which we know later that would be a big theme in his boxing career, and ultimately that's what destroyed Mike Tyson. This strong, powerful urge for sex. In my opinion, that's what actually ruined his whole boxing career. The guy could have gone to greatness if he had just left these women alone and focused on his boxing career, and then when he retired from boxing, then focus on all the women. It's the same thing that got me in trouble in high school. Not to the same level as Mike Tyson, but you get where I'm coming from. But the thing is, Mike Tyson went to the boxing gym. And as they said for Mike Tyson, our goal is for Mike Tyson to go to the gym, to the ring, to the ring, to the gym, back to the ring, back to the gym, back to the gym, back to the ring. That was the old saying for Mike Tyson to keep him out of what? Trouble. And Mike Tyson, from out of nowhere, went to the Olympics. Now he fought Riddick Bowe in the Olympics. Just to let you know, he fought. He was there in that 1984 class of the Olympic boxing team. You know, it was Evander Holyfield, it was Lennox Lewis, it was Riddick Bowe, Razor Riddick. There were a whole bunch of guys on that team that did boxing. And hold on, I don't know. Like I said, people call and they like to interrupt the video appreciation. So I apologize. The first time it was my job calling. The second time is some moron who likes to call, and it's like, we don't want you calling early in the morning. People love to do this because it's Monday, it's morning, it's the beginning of the day, and it messes up the video appreciation, so I apologize. In the next video, you won't be getting no phone calls and interruptions and nonsense. So like I was saying, Mike Tyson was in that class. Periodic Whittaker was in that weight class. Yeah, there was a lot of guys in that 1984 class. I think Sugar Ray Leonard tried to pop up on that 1984 class, but he was too young, and they told him, come back in 3 years, so it wasn't until 1986 or 87 that Sugar Ray Leonard popped up in that class. But by then he was already boxing because he tried for the 1976 Olympic class. So it might be 1984 or 1985 boxing class that Sugar Ray Leonard popped up in that picture. They were all young kids at that time. So, yeah, I'm giving you guys some boxing history. Tyson did try for the Olympics and he lost. And 1985 was his debut in boxing. And when Tyson came out, you could not go get nothing to eat. You could not get nothing to drink. When you saw Mike Tyson fight, you went to go to the restroom, you came back, fight was over. Tyson knocked somebody out in the first round of his debut. That's how fast he punched. That's how hard he hit. You didn't get a chance to even get into your defense, your offense. You got knocked out by Mike Tyson. And he wouldn't do this in one fight. This would be like in 20 fights, he would knock people out. At that time, he had a perfect record, 20 wins with no losses, 20 knockouts, 20 fights. And then finally in 1986, his boxing trainer had died of pneumonia, which kind of hurted Mike Tyson. It heartbroken him because this was like his father figure. This was someone that he respected. This is someone he looked up to and revered. He'd do anything this man told him. Customata made Mike Tyson into a scientific boxing fighter. And Mike Tyson wasn't just looking for punching and knocking you out. Not yet. That would change much later in his boxing career. So in 1986, Mike Tyson won the IBF Heavyweight Championship belt. Either the IBF or the WBA. He won one of those in 1986 and became the heavyweight champion. By 1987 and 1988, Mike Tyson was undefeated as a heavyweight champion. Then Tyson finally got the championship fight that he was looking for. He would soon fight Michael Spinks, who at that time was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. And Mike Tyson had one of the greatest knockouts in boxing history. To this day, there has never been a boxer in the heavyweight division before Mike Tyson and after Mike Tyson that knocked Michael Spinks out in 91 seconds. This fight was so short. Just imagine, it took you 7 months to see this fight, right? You had to pay almost $1,000 a seat. You finally get into the boxing arena. You waited 3 hours for the main event, and when it finally comes, it's champion versus champion in the heavyweight division. And what you see at the start of the bell of the first round, Tyson knocks out Michael Spinks in 91 seconds, and all of a sudden, what do you see Mike Tyson with? Three championship belts, either 2 or 3 championship belts to become the reigning undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. And then he goes on and he fights other fighters. There's James Tillman. Then he takes on Tony Tucker and beats him in the submission. Then he has this one fight that lasts 6 rounds. And then we finally started getting the Michael Buffer calling Mike Tyson fights. Thanks to Don King and Donald Trump, we get Michael Buffer, who's by far the greatest ring announcer in boxing history, coming in from Catskill, New York, with black trim, 5'10", 220 pounds. He is the reigning, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, Iron Mike Tyson. Yeah, I watched boxing when I was a kid, and I liked it the way Michael Buffer would announce the fighters. I just like it. So I done the videos, the makeup for the phone calls 10 minutes ago. So some of y'all like it, some of y'all will hate it, some of you will thumbs it up, some of you will thumbs it down. Some of you will say it's a good impression, some of you will say I'm way off key, but either way I had to do it in the video. That's when Michael Buffer started coming in the boxing and started becoming the voice of announcing these fights. And of course, you know how he says, "Are you ready?" I said, "Are you ready? Let's get ready to rumble!" I liked it as a kid. Tyson fought Larry Holmes, beat Larry Holmes. And then Tyson had the fight that nobody thought would ever happen. He was supposed to fight Evander Holyfield. Fight never got made. Instead, he ended up fighting a guy in Tokyo, beat him, and then 4 months later comes back to Tokyo, Japan, and who does he fight? James Buster Douglas. And gets knocked out in 10 rounds and loses the undisputed championship belts to a guy that everyone called in boxing the nice guy of boxing. And it was a shock to see a guy lose the championship belt. He had 7 championship title defenses, and he was undefeated even as a heavyweight. This is when Tyson's style of being a scientific fighter changed from being scientific to being a headhunter. In boxing, it's a political term in boxing. When we say headhunter, because I'm a street fighter, a martial arts expert, and I got 14 years of experience of being a martial artist and a street fighter, when they say the word headhunter, they mean you just are looking for a punch. You just want to hit someone with a punch. You're not trying to finish the fight. You just want to hit somebody so you can end the fight as quick as possible. Tyson started changing his style. Don King wanted the style of his fighting to be changed for entertainment purposes. So Tyson was just now in the ring to just knock people out, and that was considered entertainment. Instead of being the scientific fighter that Tyson was that made him heavyweight champion, now he changed his style up to be a headhunter. And that's how come he lost to James Buster Douglas. He didn't train for the fight. Here's Douglas that's training for 8 weeks, and here's Mike Tyson playing around for 8 weeks. Alcohol, drugs, prostitutes, and James Douglas is going to the gym for 8 weeks training for this fight. Everyone thought Tyson was going to win the heavyweight championship belt, retain it, and knock Buster Douglas out in Tokyo of 1990, and we saw the opposite. Tyson was never the same after that. The guy was no longer the same Mike Tyson after that fight. Yeah, he had a fight after that, and he won the fight after that, but he weren't the same. And then he got hit with a sexual assault rape charge, and then went to jail in Indiana for 5 years. And that's how come we never got Tyson versus Evander Holyfield. Of course, we know Evander took the belt from Buster James Douglas in 3 rounds, and we never got that fight. While Tyson was in jail, the heavyweight division now had a problem. They now had no superstar in the heavyweight division that could kind of get people to watch heavyweight fights. Lennox Lewis had came into the fold, but no one accepted Lennox Lewis yet. Lennox won a championship belt, And, you know, they wanted to see Lennox Lewis versus Riddick Bowe. And you should know by now, Riddick Bowe was a coward because he threw the heavyweight, the WBC belt, into the trash can. And as he liked to say, and I quote, if Lennox Lewis wants to be the WBC heavyweight champion of the world, he has to get the belt out of the trash can, and we can call Lennox Lewis the garbage man for taking the belt out of the trash can. And I agree with Lennox Lewis. That's like a bitch move. That's like a coward. You mean to tell me you could not fight Lennox Lewis man to man, face to face in the ring, so you could go on live television like a coward, like a punk, and throw the belt in the trash can because you don't want to fight Lennox Lewis? So we couldn't get that fight. We couldn't even get. So instead, when they slapped Riddick Bowe with $1,000 fine, because he did get $1,000 fine, the only fight we could get was Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis fought Michael Stokes, who knocked Lennox Lewis out in the first fight. So you could see where that problem came for Lennox Lewis. He wasn't going to become the star yet of the heavyweight division. And then we had to have a trilogy, which was Riddick Bowe versus Evander Holyfield, because we had no Mike Tyson. We had a superstar, and he had to go to jail for 5 years. At that same time, finally in 1988, there was another heavyweight looking to make a name for himself. Born and raised in Oklahoma, Tommy Morrison. Started boxing at the age of 13, 14 years old. He was told by his boxing trainer that if he wanted to be serious, he needed to graduate high school. So he graduated high school. He got on the boxing team. He didn't want to go to college. Right from the beginning, his dream was to be a heavyweight champion of the world. And he was told by the people of Oklahoma, it'll never happen. You'll never do it. And he started boxing right away in 1988. As soon as he got in the ring, he knocked somebody out, I think in the third or in the fourth round. They were knocked out. And then right away you could tell at 5'11", close to 6 feet tall, 230 pounds with a muscular build, you know, this American-bred boy, you could see right away that Tommy Morrison was going to become our next big superstar. And it wasn't until 1989 that he actually had a fight with Razor Reddick. He beat him. He beat all the same people that Tyson fought in the same fashion. All his fights, they ended with big knockouts. Here was the difference between the way Tommy Morrison knocked out his boxing victims and the way Tyson did it. When Tyson knocked you out, Tyson had this look on his face like, mother, do you know who I am? When Tommy Morrison knocked you out, you kind of had to hear this grr when he punched your ass. That's the difference. By 1990, Tommy Morrison did fight in a heavyweight championship fight and lost his first championship fight because he had never been in the ring before. And it wasn't until 91 that he became a contender. And again, he was just beating people. Like he literally was just beating people. And then finally in 1992, he again were just beating people. And then finally he got the championship title shot that he had been logging for. Finally in 93 or in 94, at the age of 26 years old, going on 27 in his prime, he finally had a chance to face a George Foreman who came out of retirement. George Foreman, who knocked out Michael Moore, who was heavyweight champion and was going to become our boxing star because he beat Evander Holyfield. And Evander Holyfield had a rematch with Riddick Bowe, and Riddick Bowe had lost the championship belt, and somehow, some way, Michael Moore got one of the belts, and then someone else had one of the belts, and George Foreman knocked out Michael Moore, which took like 10 rounds for this fight to happen. It took 10 rounds to knock out Michael Moore, but he did. And George Foreman won the championship belt, which was the IBF. And Tommy Morrison would fight George Foreman in that first championship. Like, George Foreman had like at least 3 championship title defenses. So in this fourth one, guess what happened? You saw Tommy Morrison beat George Foreman. So Tommy finally had a championship belt, and he managed to win at least 2 or 3 championship title defenses as we moved to the 1990s. It was like 95, and we had Evander Holyfield versus Riddick Bowe 3. Riddick Bowe beat Evander Holyfield twice, so they kind of had the idea maybe we could do Tommy Morrison versus Riddick Bowe. Like, it would be a nice warm-up So when Tyson gets out of jail, Tyson would do his thing. Finally, Tyson came into the fold, and Tyson ended up getting out of jail. He beat Frank Bruno, took the WBC belt from Frank Bruno. Now Tyson had a championship belt. Tommy Morrison had a championship belt. And then we were gonna finally see both these fighters get it on. And then finally, Tommy Morrison lost the championship belt, got knocked out, and then he got diagnosed with HIV in '96, and he couldn't box no more. And you could see the disappointments. Hold on, people. So he got hit with HIV, and it ruined his boxing career. Like, Tommy Morrison wasn't the same. I mean, he lost at the 3 or 4 championship title defenses. He lost the championship belt. They scrapped the idea of Riddick Bowe versus Tommy Morrison. They scrapped the idea of Tommy Morrison versus Evander Holyfield, and it was like 97, 98. They tried to keep his HIV thing a secret, and that's how he got to have a fight with Lennox Lewis. And he lost to Lennox Lewis. He got knocked out by Lennox Lewis. Once Lennox Lewis knocked him out, you could see Tommy Morrison was not only past his prime, you could see that the guy that we saw in the 80s and the early 90s, he just wasn't the same Tommy Morrison. There wasn't no power in his punches. You could see his legs were shaky. You could see that because he took antibiotic steroids, which I wish he had not taken, because he already had natural power. He already had natural punching power to knock you out. He took the antibiotics to get bigger and stronger, and that came from the movie Rocky V. And even Sylvester Stallone told him behind the scenes, I don't think you need to take steroids. You're already big and strong as it is. And he didn't want to listen to Sylvester Stallone, and Sylvester Stallone told him, you're going to ruin your boxing career. And you see what it done. You see what it ultimately led to. It led to him losing. Well, after he got knocked out by Lennox Lewis, when we got to 99 and 2000, he took a break from boxing. By 2001, the rumors came out that he had been diagnosed with HIV. He tried to get a boxing license and he got denied. And by 2002 and 2003, all he could do was just train and do boxing expeditions that were non-televised fights. And that turned out that was just a rumor. He was trying to get back into boxing in the 2000s, and they just would not deny it. By this difficult period, Mike Tyson had become a 3-time heavyweight champion in boxing. And Tyson hadn't gotten any better when he got out of jail. Starting with 96, 95 is when Tyson got released, which is strange and ironic, because the same year Tyson got out of jail in 1995, that's the same year Tupac got out of jail. And in 96, you should know, he beat up Frank Bruno, became a 2-time heavyweight champion, and Tupac was at that fight, and they were shaking hands, hugging each other, talking about how they were glad to get out of jail the same year. And we all know Tupac got gunned down in '96, which was tragic. And that was the year Tyson had a fight with Evander Holyfield. And Evander Holyfield knocked out Tyson in 11 rounds. And Tyson lost the championship belt to Evander Holyfield. Rematch, March 1997. Evander Holyfield beat up Mike Tyson for 3 rounds, and we saw Tyson do something in boxing history that was not being an entertainer or a scientific fighter. He went off and bit both of Evander Holyfield's ears. And I was like, that's not the Mike Tyson I remember growing up watching as a fighter. And by 98, we saw him knock a tall white guy out that was already knocked out. Then he had a fight with Andrew Galata in 1999, which Tyson won by disqualification because the guy was on drugs in the boxing fight, and the guy would do weird, strange things in the ring, and Tyson would complain to the referee that the guy was doing weird things in the ring, and had to stop the fight because he didn't even realize they were fighting. That's how bad that fight was. And then by 2000, Tyson fought another guy that had got released from jail, which Tyson happened to win that fight. By 2001, they were going to finally do Tyson versus Lennox Lewis. By this time, Lennox Lewis was a three-time heavyweight champion and was now the reigning undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Lennox Lewis had all three championship belts. Lennox Lewis has been boxing for 15, 16 years. Lennox Lewis was now a superstar. Lennox Lewis had fought all the other guys and beaten all the other guys. And now there was one person on Lennox Lewis' resume that he hadn't fought, Tyson. And they couldn't get the fight started because Tyson had to fight one more person, which he did. And Tyson won the fight. They'll become number one contender. And finally, in 2002, this fight finally kicked off. And this fight was brutal. Like, I would say the first 4 rounds, Tyson returned to the old Tyson that we hadn't seen. And then, Lennox Lewis knocked Mike Tyson out and retained all 3 belts. And you could just see the writing was on the wall. This was no longer the Tyson of the 80s. This wasn't the Mike Tyson of the 90s. We were now in the 2000s. And you could see this just was not a Mike Tyson that anyone expected. And by 2005, Tyson had his last fight and quit on the stool, which shocked everyone when he said, "I'm not an animal anymore." And you could see that all the years build up to this one moment. Tyson was no longer Tyson. Now, the what if is, what if Tommy and Mike Tyson had fought in their prime? I would probably say between 1990, had it not been James Buster Douglas, had it been Tommy that fought Mike Tyson, and had Tyson had someone of his old administration that got him to train the way he normally would have fought. Now, when Tyson got out of jail and won a championship belt, and Tommy Morrison won a championship belt, because Tommy Morrison won a belt from George Foreman in '94, and he had 3 or 4 championship title defenses as champion. And Tyson had just won a belt back from Frank Bruno in '95 going into '96. And at that point, I would honestly say, had they done the fight in '95 or '96, had they done Tyson versus Tommy Morrison, the first fight, I think Tyson probably would have won because it would have been the first fight. And Tommy most definitely would have won a rematch. Tommy would have won the rematch. So you would have got a Tyson versus Tommy Morrison part 1 and part 2. By the time Evander said, "Hey, I want to fight Tyson," it would have went like this. It would have went, whoever won the third and final fight would have fought Evander Holyfield. Eventually, you would have got probably something like, eventually you would have got Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield anyway, but he would have had to fight Tommy Morrison twice. Because you got to consider that that would have been the chance for Tommy to prove that he's a superstar. Now, if Tommy won the first fight, it would have been because he was unstoppable his first 5 or 6 years in the heavyweight division. If there was a third fight, if these two had ever fought in an altering timeline, like let's say Tyson never went to jail, and let's say Tommy Morrison never got HIV, and let's say these two were supposed to fight in '95, '96, but instead they end up fighting in '99, 2000. Well, at that point, it's Tommy Morrison, because Tommy Morrison would have still been in his prime. Tyson, by the time he approached 2001, 2002, Mike Tyson was way past his prime, because Tyson started his boxing career in 1985, and by 1990, you can see that was the end of him in his prime. He fought in the 90s going into the 2000s, but by the time we get to the 2000s, he would have been far removed from his physical prime. And it would have just been performance enhancement drugs keeping him in shape. Tommy would have still been in his prime because Tommy started his boxing career the late 80s, early 90s, and by the time we got to the 2000s, Tommy Morrison would have been maybe 3 years away from not being in his prime, but would still be good enough to still win the fight. Worst case scenario, it ends in a tie, their first fight. And then someone would have to win the second fight. And then you probably would never get Evander Holyfield versus Tyson if it led into the 2000s. You probably would have ended up seeing Evander Holyfield fight Lennox Lewis 3 times, or someone else for that matter. And then it would have been Lennox Lewis fighting Tyson or Tommy Morrison at that point, which we already saw Tommy Morrison fight Lennox Lewis, and if they fought a second time, Lennox would have won again. At that point, you would have had a Klitschko come in there when Lennox retired. So there's a lot of possibilities on why these two could have fought and why these two will go down in history as never facing each other when they were both champions around the same time of the 1990s. Alright, this video lasted a little bit longer than it was because we have all these interruptions. I promise you the next video ain't going to be no 30 minutes. Next time on What If on Boxing. From Baltimore, he is the 3-time welterweight middleweight champion of the world, Sugar Ray Leonard versus Floyd Money Mayweather. Next time on What If Boxing, Sugar Ray Leonard in his prime versus Floyd Mayweather in his prime. I guarantee you that will be a better video than this one.